In the summer of 1863, the United States was cracking at the seams. The Civil War was going badly for the Union. After 2 years of brutal fighting, defeat felt terrifyingly close. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, led by the man who seemed invincible, Robert E. Lee, had just crushed their opponents at Chancellorsville and was now marching north. They were taking the war onto Union soil for the second time. With his army's morale soaring, Lee planned to deliver a fatal blow, capture a major northern city, break the will of the American people, and force President Abraham Lincoln to sue for peace. The quiet fields of a small Pennsylvania town called Gettysburg were about to become the scene of the bloodiest battle in American history, a savage 3-day clash that promised only more death. But what happened here was more than just a military victory. It was a moment that would spark a deep transformation in the nation's soul and ultimately redefine what it meant to be American. To really get how transformative Gettysburg was, you have to understand the desperation of that summer. For the Confederacy, spirits had never been higher. The Army of Northern Virginia was a hardened veteran force that felt, with good reason, that they were unbeatable. One Southern soldier wrote home, "You may expect to hear brilliant achievements from our invincible army." Their commander, Robert E. Lee, was a military legend, loved in the South and feared in the North. His plan for invading Pennsylvania was ambitious and had several goals. First, he wanted to give war-torn Virginia a break, letting his army live off the rich farms of Pennsylvania. Second, by taking the war north, he hoped to wreck the Union's summer plans and threaten big cities like Harrisburg or even Philadelphia. The ultimate prize was political. A big victory on Northern soil could energize the anti-war movement and maybe even convince Britain and France to officially recognize the Confederacy. For the Union, the mood couldn't have been more different. The Army of the Potomac was demoralized. They'd suffered a string of crushing defeats and had gone through commanders like a revolving door. One Union soldier captured the gloom perfectly when he wrote, "What disgrace is greater than to belong to the Army of the Potomac?" Just 3 days before the battle, President Lincoln swapped leaders again, putting the cautious, lesser-known General George Gordon Meade in charge. Meade was now leading a huge but shaken army of about 93,000 men, with orders to hunt down Lee and protect Washington, D.C. at all costs. So you have 2 massive armies marching toward each other, one overflowing with confidence, the other riddled with doubt. The fate of the nation was hanging in the balance, and the stage for their accidental bloody meeting was a small town known for its 10 converging roads, Gettysburg. The battle didn't start with some grand strategy. It started with a search for shoes. On the morning of July 1, 1863, Confederate infantry under General Henry Heth marched toward Gettysburg because they'd heard there was a supply of footwear in town. What they found instead, just west of town, was Union cavalry, dismounted and ready for a fight, commanded by Brigadier General John Buford. Buford was a sharp, tough commander who saw right away how important the high ground south of Gettysburg was. The hills we now know as Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. He knew if the Confederates took that ground, the Union Army would be in serious trouble. His mission was simple, but huge. Hold on as long as possible to buy time for Union infantry to arrive. Around 7:30 a.m., the first shot rang out. Buford's outnumbered cavalrymen fought like hell, using their fast-firing carbines to sound like a much bigger force. For hours, they held off 2 advancing Confederate brigades. By mid-morning, the first Union infantry reinforcements arrived, the veteran Chasseur Corps under Major General John F. Reynolds. Reynolds rode ahead, directing his troops onto McPherson's Ridge, when a bullet struck and killed him instantly. He was the highest-ranking officer to die at Gettysburg. Command fell to Major General Abner Doubleday, who threw his men into the chaos, including the famous Iron Brigade, known for their black hats and fierce reputation. For a while, the Union lines held, but as the day dragged on, more and more Confederates poured into the area. A massive assault from General Richard Ewell's corps hit the Union from the north, while A.P. Hill's corps pushed from the west. The Union 18th Corps, north of town, finally buckled under the pressure, and the battered Hess Corps was flanked and forced to retreat. What came next was a frantic retreat through the streets of Gettysburg. Thousands of Union soldiers were captured as they ran for the high ground Buford had spotted hours earlier. Cemetery Hill. By day's end, the Confederates had a clear victory. They held the town, but the Union Army held the better defensive ground to the south. When General Meade arrived that night and saw the strong defensive position, he made the call to stay and fight. The Union line was taking on a legendary shape, a 3-mile-long fishhook, anchored by Culp's Hill on the right, curving around Cemetery Hill and stretching south along Cemetery Ridge to a rocky hill called Little Round Top. The first day was over, but the real test was just beginning. July the 2nd was a day of relentless, savage fighting. This is the day that cemented Gettysburg's reputation for pure carnage, as men fought and died over patches of ground that seemed meaningless, a rocky hill, a wheat field, a peach orchard. The two armies suffered nearly 35,000 combined casualties over the first 2 days. General Lee's plan was to hit both ends of the Union's fishhook line at the same time. He figured he could shatter the Federal Army with a 1-2 punch. He ordered his most trusted general, James Longstreet, to attack the Union left while General Ewell's corps hit the right flank at Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. But the main attack was delayed. Longstreet wasn't sold on the plan, and his troops had a long, tough march to get into position. That delay gave the Union Army precious time to shore up its defenses. Then, a controversial move by a Union general lit the fuse. Major General Daniel Sickles, commander of the III Corps, didn't like the low ground he'd been assigned. Acting without orders, he moved his entire corps of 10,000 men forward to the Emmitsburg Road, creating a bulge in the line that was exposed and incredibly difficult to defend. Around 4 p.m., Longstreet's Confederates finally attacked, slamming right into Sickles's exposed troops. The result was some of the most desperate fighting of the war, swirling around 3 landmarks now burned into American memory. First, Devil's Den, a jumble of massive boulders that became a slaughterhouse as Texans and Arkansans fought hand-to-hand with Union soldiers. Just north of there was a 20-acre field of wheat, soon to be known as the Bloody Wheat Field. For 3 hours, the field changed hands at least 5 times as fresh brigades were thrown into the meat grinder. Men fell in waves, and the wheat was trampled and stained red. The fighting also consumed a nearby peach orchard, where Sickles's corps was practically annihilated as a fighting force. Sickles himself had his leg shattered by a cannonball. Just as the Union left was about to collapse, one of the most legendary moments of the Civil War unfolded. The very end of the Union line was a rocky, unoccupied hill called Little Round Top. Governor K. Warren, the Union's chief engineer, spotted the glint of Confederate bayonets moving toward it just in time. He frantically called for reinforcements. The first to answer was a brigade led by Colonel Strong Vincent, which included the 20th Maine, commanded by a former professor named Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. For over an hour, the men from Maine fought off wave after wave of Alabamians trying to take the hill and flank the entire Union Army. His men were exhausted, out of ammunition, and facing another charge when Chamberlain made a stunning choice. He ordered them to fix bayonets. In a breathtaking, desperate maneuver, the 20th Maine charged down the hill like a swinging door of steel, sweeping the shocked Confederates away and saving the Union flank. Meanwhile, on the Union right, Ewell's attacks on Culp's Hill and East Cemetery Hill started late and were ultimately fought off. As darkness finally stopped the slaughter of July the 2nd, the Union lines had bent, but they hadn't broken. Lee's plan to crush the Army of the Potomac had failed, but he wasn't deterred. Convinced his men were on the edge of victory, he decided to try one more time, with one final desperate gamble on Day 3. July 3rd began with a battlefield littered with the dead and dying. After being thrown back on both flanks, Lee became convinced that Meade must have weakened the center of his line to send reinforcements. It was there, at the center of the Union fishhook on Cemetery Ridge, that Lee decided to risk everything on one massive frontal assault. His subordinate, General Longstreet, pleaded with him not to do it, believing it was suicide. But Lee wouldn't be swayed. The plan was to start with the largest artillery bombardment of the war to blast a hole in the Union defenses. Around 1 p.m., the hot, humid air exploded as nearly 150 Confederate cannons opened fire. Union artillery roared back, and for almost 2 hours, the armies engaged in a thunderous duel that shook the ground for miles. The smoke was so thick it blocked out the sun, creating a hellscape of noise, fire, and death. Then, around 3 p.m., the cannons went quiet. Out of the woods on Seminary Ridge, the Confederate infantry appeared. It was an awesome, terrifying sight. Around 12,500 men from 3 divisions, commanded by Generals George Pickett, Johnston Pettigrew, and Isaac Trimble, began their advance. Pickett's division was fresh, and his name would be forever tied to the charge. They marched with eerie, parade ground precision across nearly a mile of open fields, straight toward a small clump of trees marking the Union center. They were a perfect target. Union artillery, which had saved ammunition during the duel, opened up with horrifying effect, tearing huge gaps in the Confederate lines. As they struggled over fences on the Emmitsburg Road, they walked into a storm of musket fire from nearly 20,000 waiting Union soldiers. The Confederate lines staggered but pushed forward with almost unbelievable bravery. A small fraction of them, maybe a few hundred men led by Brigadier General Lewis Armistead, actually broke through the Union line at a stone wall, a spot now known as the high water mark of the Confederacy. Armistead, his hat on the tip of his sword, was shot and killed as he crossed the wall. The hand-to-hand fighting was savage but short. Union reinforcements poured in, and the Confederates were killed, captured, or forced to run. The charge was a disaster. In less than an hour, the attacking force suffered over 6,500 casualties, more than 50%. As the shattered survivors stumbled back, Lee rode out to meet them, taking full responsibility, saying, "This has all been my fault." Pickett was devastated. When Lee told him to rally his division, he reportedly answered, "General, I have no division now." The battle was over. Lee's invasion of the North was broken. On July 4th, the same day the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant, Lee began his miserable retreat back to Virginia in a driving rain. In the wake of the armies, Gettysburg was a vision of hell. The town's 2,400 residents were faced with more than 20,000 wounded soldiers. Every church, home, and barn became a hospital. The fields were covered with the dead, both men and horses, rotting under the July sun. The sheer scale of the carnage was staggering. In 3 days, the battle produced as many as 51,000 casualties, making it the bloodiest battle in American history. The Union suffered 23,000 casualties, while the Confederacy lost over 28,000, more than a third of Lee's entire army. News of the victory sent a wave of relief across the North. Headlines screamed that Waterloo had been eclipsed. For the first time, it felt like the war was turning. For Union soldiers, beating Lee's supposedly unbeatable army on their own soil was a huge boost to their morale. For the Confederacy, the defeat was a crushing blow, not just militarily, but psychologically. The aura of invincibility was gone for good. Gettysburg, combined with the fall of Vicksburg, is widely seen as the great turning point of the Civil War. From this moment on, the Confederacy was on the defensive, on a slow but certain path to surrender. But the story of how Gettysburg changed America doesn't stop there. Its deepest impact came 4.5 months later, delivered not by a general, but by a president. On November 19, 1863, a crowd of about 15,000 people gathered on the battlefield to dedicate a part of it as the Soldiers' National Cemetery. The main speaker was a famous orator named Edward Everett, who spoke for 2 hours. President Abraham Lincoln was just invited to give a few appropriate remarks. When Lincoln stood up, he delivered a speech that lasted less than 2 minutes and was only 271 words long. He didn't talk about strategy or heroes. Instead, he reached back in time, not to the Constitution, but to the nation's birth certificate, the Declaration of Independence. He began, "407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." With these words, Lincoln was doing something radical. He was reframing the entire purpose of the war. It was no longer just about preserving the Union as it was. It was now a test of whether a nation founded on liberty and equality could even survive. The sacrifice of the men who died at Gettysburg, Lincoln argued, was for something much bigger than political unity. He called on the living to make sure that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. A new birth of freedom. That phrase was the heart of the transformation. It explicitly tied the war to the promise of emancipation and the end of slavery. Lincoln was defining a new American identity, one that would strive to live up to the promise that all men are created equal. In his short, powerful speech, he gave meaning to the suffering and turned a field of slaughter into a symbol of national rebirth. As one senator later said, the battle itself was less important than the speech. The ideas forged at Gettysburg continue to shape America, reminding us of the ongoing struggle to perfect the Union. If you find this look at American history valuable and think these stories need to be remembered, please subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss our next deep dive into the moments that defined us. The Battle of Gettysburg was a monumental event. It was the decisive military turning point of the Civil War, the moment the tide turned for good in the Union's favor. It was the high water mark of the Confederacy, a final desperate grab for a victory that would never come. But its true, lasting power is how it changed the nation's understanding of itself. Before Gettysburg, the war was mainly about preserving a broken Union. After Gettysburg, and especially after Lincoln's address, it became a war for a new kind of Union, one committed to a new birth of freedom. It was a profound shift that set the stage for the abolition of slavery and the constitutional amendments that would try to guarantee liberty and citizenship for all Americans. This transformation wasn't instant, and it wasn't complete. The road to fulfilling the promise of equality would be long and painful. The reconciliation that followed the war often chose white unity over racial justice, leaving a complex legacy that the nation is still wrestling with today. Still, the change that started on those bloody fields in Pennsylvania was real. Gettysburg was more than a battle. It was a crucible where a new American identity was forged in blood and fire. It's where the question of what it means to be an American was asked in the most brutal way possible, and where the answer began to take shape: a nation consecrated by sacrifice, forever striving to live up to its founding ideal, that all people are created equal. It's a battle that never truly ended, a struggle that continues in the heart of America to this day.